Here's what nobody's telling you about Venezuela right now. While warships circle the Caribbean and the world watches what looks like another regime change operation, something extraordinary just happened behind the scenes, something that reveals the true stakes of this confrontation. According to reports from summer 2025, Maduro's government offered Washington perhaps the most generous package any adversary has extended to the United States in decades. Venezuela proposed opening all existing and future oil and gold projects to American companies, granting preferential contracts to U.S. businesses, reversing the flow of Venezuelan oil exports from China back to the United States, and slashing energy and mining contracts with Chinese, Iranian, and Russian firms. This wasn't just a deal, it was essentially an unconditional surrender of Venezuela's resource sovereignty to American corporate interests. The response from the Trump administration? A hard no. Instead, military assets continue accumulating off Venezuela's coast. But here's where it gets really interesting. While Washington rejected Maduro's offer, Beijing doubled down. China unveiled a zero-tariff trade agreement with Venezuela at the Shanghai Expo, signed a bilateral investment treaty, and private Chinese companies are now investing over $1 billion in Venezuelan oil fields under 20-year production contracts. China's already Venezuela's biggest creditor, holding some $60 billion in loans, and now they're tightening that economic stranglehold even further. So why would the United States turn down exactly what it claims to want? If this is about oil, democracy, or drug trafficking, why reject a deal that gives American companies unprecedented access to the world's largest oil reserves without firing a shot? The answer reveals something far more significant about how global power actually works. This isn't about Venezuela's resources. Those can always be obtained through trade. This is about something much bigger: control over the global economic architecture itself, and which system, Washington's rules-based order or Beijing's emerging alternative, will dominate the Western Hemisphere and beyond. Venezuela has become the chessboard where two incompatible visions of world order are colliding, and what happens next will reshape far more than just one country's fate. Now let's talk about what really happened during those months of negotiations between Washington and Caracas, because this is where the story gets truly fascinating and reveals something fundamental about how power actually operates in our world today. You see, according to multiple reports from the New York Times and other outlets, throughout the summer and early fall of 2025, Venezuelan officials were in extensive discussions with the Trump administration, and what they put on the table wasn't some minor concession or symbolic gesture. This was essentially an offer to dismantle the entire architecture of resource nationalism that had defined Venezuelan policy since Hugo Chavez took power back in 1999. Think about that for a moment. We're talking about opening all existing and future oil and gold projects to American companies, giving preferential contracts to United States businesses, reversing the flow of Venezuelan oil exports away from China and back to the United States, and dramatically reducing or eliminating energy and mining contracts with Chinese, Iranian, and Russian firms. This wasn't just a deal, this was a complete strategic realignment that would have fundamentally altered the geopolitical landscape of Latin America and reshaped global energy markets, and Trump confirmed it himself. In mid-October, during a meeting with his cabinet and Ukrainian President Zelensky, the president didn't mince words. He said Maduro has offered everything and explained why with characteristic bluntness: because he doesn't want to mess around with the United States. There it was, out in the open. The Venezuelan government, facing an unprecedented military buildup in the Caribbean, was willing to hand over access to the world's largest proven oil reserves, estimated at over 300 billion barrels, to avoid what appeared to be an imminent military confrontation. But here's where this story takes its most revealing turn. The Trump administration rejected the offer, not just parts of it, not just certain conditions. They cut off diplomatic engagement entirely. According to sources close to the discussions, President Trump personally ordered his officials to end the diplomatic outreach with Venezuela, which effectively killed the deal, at least in its proposed form. Now pause and think about this carefully. If the United States was genuinely concerned about Venezuelan oil flowing to China, if the issue was really about ensuring American companies had access to these resources, if the goal was to break Venezuela's economic ties with Iran and Russia, then this offer represented everything Washington claimed to want. Without firing a single shot, without risking American lives, without the massive costs of a military intervention, the United States could have secured dominant access to Venezuela's natural wealth and severed Caracas's economic lifelines to Beijing, Tehran, and Moscow. So why say no? Why reject an offer that, on its face, appears to give you exactly what you publicly claim you're after? This is the question that should keep us all awake at night, because the answer reveals something much deeper about contemporary geopolitics than any official statement or press briefing ever will. To understand what's really happening here, we need to look at what China was doing at precisely the same moment Washington was rejecting Maduro's offer. While the Trump administration was building up its military presence in the Caribbean, while warships were circling and strikes were being conducted against alleged drug boats, China was quietly but decisively deepening its economic presence in Venezuela. In August of 2025, a private Chinese firm called China Concord Resources Corp, or CCRC, began a remarkable operation in Lake Maracaibo in western Venezuela. They deployed a floating oil production platform called the Alula Jackup Rig, backed by a $1 billion investment commitment. This wasn't just another Chinese company buying Venezuelan oil at discount prices. This was China establishing permanent infrastructure, deploying skilled personnel, and committing to a 20-year production sharing contract with Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA. The numbers are striking. CCRC is working to boost crude production in the Lago Cinco and Lagunitas Lago oil fields from 12,000 barrels per day to 60,000 barrels per day by the end of 2026. They plan to reopen up to 500 wells and are investing over $1 billion in infrastructure rehabilitation and new drilling. Under the terms of their agreement, light crude will go to PDVSA for domestic use, while heavy crude will be exported to China. And this is happening in an environment where United States sanctions have made it essentially impossible for major Western oil companies to operate in Venezuela. The big names won't touch Venezuela because of the risk of American secondary sanctions, but that created an opening, and Chinese firms, particularly private entities like CCRC that operate with somewhat more flexibility than state-owned giants, moved in to fill the vacuum. Now here's what makes this so strategically significant. By the time of the Shanghai Expo in November 2025, China and Venezuela announced a zero-tariff trade agreement. They signed a bilateral investment treaty, and according to reports, over 90% of Venezuela's oil exports are now going to China. The economic relationship has reached a level of integration that would have been almost unthinkable a decade ago. But we need to understand what this really means. This isn't just about oil transactions. China has become Venezuela's largest creditor, holding somewhere around $60 billion in loans accumulated over the Chavez and Maduro years. Those loans were often structured as oil-for-loan agreements where Venezuela would repay China not in cash but in petroleum shipments. So China isn't just buying Venezuelan oil at market rates. They're secured creditors with long-term claims on Venezuelan production. They've built infrastructure to extract and transport that oil. They've deployed their own technical personnel to operate the facilities. And they've done this under 20-year contracts that give them extraordinary long-term visibility and security of supply. What China has constructed in Venezuela isn't just a trading relationship. It's an integrated supply chain that's increasingly resistant to external pressure, and that's exactly the problem from Washington's perspective. Because when we talk about the emerging global order, when we discuss the competition between the American-led system and what China is building, Venezuela has become a perfect case study in how those two systems operate differently and what's at stake in the competition between them. The American approach, the one that's dominated global economics since the end of World War II, is built on a specific architecture. It relies on the dollar as the global reserve currency. It depends on international financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank that operate according to rules largely written in Washington. It requires countries to integrate into a trading system where the United States and its allies maintain the ability to impose costs through sanctions primarily on actors that violate the established rules. This system worked brilliantly for decades because if you wanted to participate in the global economy, you essentially had no choice but to play by these rules. You needed dollars to buy oil. You needed access to Western financial markets to invest and grow. You needed Western technology and expertise to develop your resources, and that gave Washington enormous leverage. If you stepped out of line, the United States could cut you off from the system, and the economic consequences would be devastating. But what China is building, particularly in places like Venezuela, operates on fundamentally different principles. It doesn't require the target country to reform its political system or adopt Western governance standards. It doesn't demand that you integrate into the dollar-based financial system. It doesn't insist that you accept American military presence or align your foreign policy with Washington's preferences. Instead, China offers infrastructure investment, often in the form of loans for construction projects built by Chinese companies using Chinese workers, It provides a market for your commodities, especially energy and minerals that China needs to fuel its industrial economy. It supplies manufactured goods, technology, and increasingly sophisticated equipment at competitive prices. And crucially, it offers an alternative payment and settlement system that can operate outside of Western financial networks. So when Venezuela found itself increasingly isolated by American sanctions, unable to access Western markets, cut off from the international financial system, China stepped in with a different model. They didn't demand that Maduro hold free elections or reform the judiciary or respect human rights. They offered a straightforward economic relationship. We'll buy your oil, we'll invest in your infrastructure, we'll provide the technology and expertise you need to maintain production, and in exchange, you'll repay us in resources and give us long-term supply security. It's transactional, it's pragmatic, and for a government like Maduro's that faces existential pressure from the West, it's a lifeline. But more than that, it's a demonstration to the rest of the world that there's an alternative to the American-led system. You don't have to accept Washington's conditions. You don't have to submit to International Monetary Fund structural adjustment programs. You don't have to open your economy to American corporations on terms dictated by the United States Treasury. And that brings us back to why Washington rejected Maduro's offer, even though it appeared to give the United States everything it claimed to want. Because the real issue isn't whether American oil companies can access Venezuelan reserves. Chevron has been operating in Venezuela throughout this entire period under a special license. ConocoPhillips has been in discussions about resuming operations. Shell is working on offshore gas projects. American companies can get into Venezuela if that's really what Washington wants. The issue is whether Venezuela will be integrated into the Western system on Western terms, or whether it will remain part of an alternative architecture that China is constructing. And from that perspective, Maduro's offer, as generous as it appeared, wasn't actually offering what Washington needs. Because even if American companies got preferential contracts, even if Venezuelan oil started flowing back to the United States instead of to China, Venezuela would still be a country that had demonstrated it could survive outside the Western system. It would still be a model for other nations facing American pressure. It would still prove that there's an alternative path, that you can defy Washington and not only survive but maintain your sovereignty and your resource base. That's the real threat from Washington's perspective. Not that China gets Venezuelan oil. Oil is fungible. It flows to whoever pays the highest price. And if China buys from Venezuela, that frees up supply from the Middle East or elsewhere that can flow to American refineries. The real threat is that Venezuela, along with countries like Russia, Iran, and increasingly others across the global south, is demonstrating that the American monopoly on global economic architecture is breaking down. And once that monopoly breaks down, once countries have genuine alternatives, Washington's leverage diminishes dramatically. This explains why the Trump administration not only rejected Maduro's offer but has actually escalated military pressure. Since late August 2025, the United States has deployed what amounts to the largest naval presence in the Caribbean since the invasion of Panama in 1989. We're talking about the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, which is the world's largest aircraft carrier, multiple guided missile destroyers, amphibious assault ships carrying thousands of Marines, nuclear-powered submarines, F-35 stealth fighters, B-52 strategic bombers. By November, there were more than 15,000 American military personnel in the region, either on ships or stationed in Puerto Rico and other locations. The stated justification is counter-narcotics operations. The Trump administration claims this massive military presence is necessary to combat drug trafficking from Venezuela. They point to the so-called Cartel de los Soles, which they allege is a drug trafficking network run by senior Venezuelan officials, including Maduro himself. They've conducted over 20 strikes on boats they claim were carrying drugs, killing more than 80 people, according to official figures. But as many analysts have pointed out, this explanation doesn't hold up to scrutiny. First, the scale of forces is wildly disproportionate to any counter-drug mission. You don't need a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier to interdict drug boats. The United States Coast Guard has been conducting counter-narcotics operations in the Caribbean for decades with a fraction of these resources. Second, Venezuela isn't even a major source of drugs entering the United States. The overwhelming majority of fentanyl, which is what's actually killing Americans in unprecedented numbers, comes from Mexico, where it's manufactured using precursor chemicals from China. Venezuela does have a role in cocaine trafficking, but it's not the primary source or transit point. Colombia produces most of the cocaine, and the primary routes into the United States run through Central America and Mexico, not through the Caribbean from Venezuela. Third, and perhaps most tellingly, the Trump administration has been remarkably vague about what exactly this operation is supposed to achieve. They talk about drug interdiction, they talk about pressuring Maduro, they talk about restoring democracy, but they haven't articulated a clear strategy or defined what success would look like. In fact, the messaging has been contradictory. Trump has suggested at various times that he wants Maduro gone, that he's open to negotiations, that military strikes on Venezuelan territory are imminent, and that reporters shouldn't read too much into the military buildup. This kind of strategic ambiguity might be intentional, designed to keep Maduro off balance, but it also suggests that the real goals of this operation aren't the stated ones. Because if you look at what's actually happening, what you see is an attempt to isolate Venezuela, both economically and militarily, to demonstrate that defying the United States carries unsustainable costs, and to make it as difficult as possible for alternative systems like China's to successfully operate in America's traditional sphere of influence. And this is where we get to the heart of what this confrontation is really about. Venezuela has become a chessboard where two incompatible visions of how the world should work are colliding. On one side, you have the American model, a rules-based international order where Washington and its allies set the rules, where access to prosperity requires playing by those rules, where stepping out of line means being cut off from the system. On the other side, you have what China is offering, a more transactional system, where political alignment matters less than economic complementarity, where countries can maintain their sovereignty and independence while still participating in global trade, where infrastructure and investment come without demands for political reform. The outcome in Venezuela matters not just because of the oil, though 300 billion barrels is certainly significant. It matters because it will send a signal to every other country watching about which model works. If Venezuela can maintain its independence, if China can successfully support a government under maximum American pressure, if the alternative architecture proves resilient enough to withstand this kind of assault, then other countries will take note. They'll see that defying Washington is survivable, they'll understand that they have options. But if the United States succeeds in forcing regime change in Venezuela, if Maduro falls and is replaced by a government that reintegrates into the Western system, if China's investments are nullified and American companies regain dominance over Venezuelan resources, that sends a different message. It tells the world that ultimately there's no escaping American power, that alternatives to the Western system are temporary and fragile, that in the end you have to play by Washington's rules. And this is why the Venezuela crisis matters far beyond Venezuela itself. We're watching in real time as the post-World War II American-dominated global order confronts its first truly viable alternative. For 7 decades, the United States has been the undisputed hegemon of the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine, updated for the modern era, meant that no outside power could establish a meaningful presence in Latin America without American permission. But China is challenging that assumption. They're demonstrating that they can project economic power into America's backyard, that they can support governments Washington opposes, that they can build alternative supply chains and financial networks that operate independent of American control. The question now is whether Washington will accept this new reality or whether it will use military force to maintain the old order. And that's what makes this moment so dangerous. Because economic competition is one thing, military confrontation is something else entirely. And what we're seeing in the Caribbean right now is the militarization of what should be an economic and political competition. The strikes on boats, the carrier deployments, the public threats from Trump, the designation of Venezuelan officials as terrorists, the closure of Venezuelan airspace, all of this represents an escalation from economic pressure to military coercion. And once you cross that threshold, once military force becomes the primary tool of statecraft, the risk of miscalculation rises dramatically. A confrontation at sea between American and Venezuelan forces, a mistake in targeting that kills Chinese workers at an oil facility, a retaliatory strike that escalates beyond what anyone intended. These scenarios, which would have seemed far-fetched just a year ago, are now well within the realm of possibility. And that's ultimately what this crisis reveals. We're living through a fundamental transition in how global power is structured. The unipolar moment, that brief period after the Cold War when American power appeared unchallengeable, is ending. Not because American power has collapsed, but because alternatives have emerged. China's economic model, whatever its flaws and limitations, has proven successful enough to offer countries a different path. And once you have competing systems, once hegemony gives way to multipolarity, the risk of conflict increases because the rules that govern interaction between great powers become unclear. What we're watching in Venezuela is the first act of this new era playing out. It's not the last act. It probably isn't even the most important act, but it's revealing because it strips away the rhetoric and forces us to confront what's actually at stake. This isn't about democracy versus authoritarianism, even though that's how it's often framed. Maduro's government is authoritarian, no question. But the United States has supported plenty of authoritarian governments when it served American interests. This isn't about drugs, despite the official justifications. The drug war has been used to justify American intervention throughout Latin America for decades, usually with catastrophic results. This isn't even really about oil, not in the simple sense of access to resources. American companies can get Venezuelan oil through deals like Chevron's. China can buy Venezuelan oil on the open market. What this is really about is which system will structure the global economy going forward. Will it be the American-led system based on dollar hegemony, Western financial institutions, and military dominance? Or will it be a multipolar system where China and potentially other powers can offer genuine alternatives to American leadership? Venezuela matters because it's the test case. It's the place where these competing visions are colliding most directly and most dramatically. And how this crisis resolves, whether through negotiation, regime change, or continued stalemate, will shape how similar conflicts play out across the global south in the years to come. Because Venezuela won't be the last country caught between these two systems, there will be others. Countries rich in resources that the great powers need, countries in strategic locations that matter for trade routes and military positioning, countries whose governments find themselves at odds with Washington but able to find support from Beijing. Each of these situations will become a miniature version of what we're seeing now in Venezuela, and the precedent set here, the playbook that emerges from this crisis, will influence how those future crises unfold. That's why paying attention to what happens next in Venezuela matters so much. Not because Venezuelan oil is uniquely important or because Maduro's fate will directly impact your life, but because what's being decided in the Caribbean right now is the shape of the global order for the next several decades. Are we moving toward a world where multiple powers can coexist and compete economically? Or are we heading toward a confrontation where the declining hegemon uses military force to maintain its primacy? That's the real question. And Venezuela is where we're going to start getting the answer.